Thank you, and thank you for being here in large numbers, despite what do we call this, portentous skies. And we're going to try and look through the chink in the clouds ahead.
This is a Latin American storm.
All right. Is it only going to fall on you? Are you going to make the rain?
Only me. This is magical realism.
Well, I would like to tell you all, but I mean only voluntarily, if you'd like to close your eyes. Because I'd like you to think about the state of the world today. 90% of the people I ask to do this, their eyes fly open within like a millisecond, within a nanosecond, because they're just looking at all the fires and the heat and the dust and the anger that we see around, the age of rage in a sense that we belong to, the aggression, the invasions, the hate, the riots, inequality, climate change, pandemics. But most importantly, what our narrative today is run by is the people who were to be the exemplars, the ones that were going to show us the way through, the leaders. And by that, I don't mean specific leaders, I just mean the leaders of the world. The most powerful nations in the world today are the ones that are breaking the rules. So when you think about those, you're very blessed to have the panel that I'm going to speak to today. Because these are three thinkers who have in their books tried to envisage for us, or at least break down for us, what the world order today is about and what we can conceivably see in the future. I should warn you that they have very different views of what we should expect. But I'm going to get right into it with 2026. And honestly speaking, we may be in January only, but I guess we could speak for the rest of this session about everything that's happened already. Vince, if I could start with you and ask you, will Trumperica, that's the only way I can describe it, will Trumperica change the world permanently? Or is what we're seeing sort of just disruptions or delays of the emerging trends in the world? You've written about India and China and the inevitability, in a sense, of their rise. What do you think Trumperica is going to do to that?
Well, I think the main damage Trump's doing is to America, actually, not just to the fabric of society, but destroying scientific research, universities, walking away from renewable energy technology. But, of course, he's damaging the world, underlining the rule of law. I think on the day he intervened in Venezuela, he also dropped from 85 international agreements and institutions. Climate change, maritime piracy, tropical forest trade. I mean, destroying a lot of the rules of the international system. But I think the question, permanent damage, well, I think you have to remember there's been a lot of colorful characters in history. And I sometimes think of Caligula, who did a 4-year term running the Roman Empire, and he did a lot of Trumpian things. He appointed a horse to the Senate. He declared himself a god. I won't mention the sex, but a lot of colorful things. But probably, classicists will correct me, didn't fundamentally change the nature of the Roman Empire. And I suspect that will be the verdict on Trump. But one final word. I think there is a real issue with Trump where his belligerence and his erratic behavior coincides with American strategic interests. A country like the UK, for example, is currently, like Japan and others, having to negotiate from weakness on tariffs. And we're being confronted with two big demands. First, a poison pill on China. You must not allow the Chinese into key technologies. We've had this with Huawei. It's now been extended. And the other is you will not regulate or tax key tech companies of the United States. I don't think the British government's yet signed on the dotted line, but that's the agenda.
And it spreads across so many fields, this kind of unilateralism. Oscar, of course, it is a little chilly now, but you have a very interesting T-shirt on.
It says, hope over fear. This is exactly what we need. I mean, you know that when the world is going to shit, this is exactly what you need. It is when things are at their worst that people find in their imagination a new vision. What we need now is to summon the courage to live the new visions. You were talking about Trump, and Vince was careful enough to name Caligula. He beat me to it. But the Caligula I have in mind is not the Roman emperor, but rather, I hope you remember Malcolm McDowell portraying Caligula in a 1978 film that was produced by the owner of soft porn magazine Penthouse, Caligula. And in this film, the first character that appears is Tiberius. So I call Donald Trump Donald T for Tiberius. Tiberius was performed in this film by Peter O'Toole, and Tiberius is assassinated in the very first 10 minutes of the film. So my fear is not so much Donald T as such, but the fact that even if, God forbid, his taste for junk food or whatever, gets rid of him, there are already two guys there. J.D. Vance on the one hand, and the one I want you to focus your attention on, Marco Rubio. You remember, those of you who saw the 1978 film, something like that happens. You have Tiberius and then Caligula and Claudius.
Right.
What we're seeing is precisely that battle in between the two of them. And my fear is that that kind of damage will be permanent.
Well, you can be sure there's going to be a lot of Googling of Caligula after the first two speakers. But Oscar, you'll have to back up over there. Your book is called A Hopeful Political Imagination, and we'll discuss that in just a bit. But your last book said, what if Latin America ruled the world? Instead, this year has begun, January 3rd, with a very, very powerful Latin American leader being taken out of his bedroom along with his wife, a kind of half decapitation of the leadership structure in Venezuela, without actually us seeing a huge pushback from Latin America. Are we seeing, in a sense, Trump-Erica change the rules and your prognosis for the world?
Let me answer in two ways, very briefly. The first one. I published that book, What If Latin America Ruled the World, back in 2010, 2013. And the book made two bets. It had to do with the fact that by 2040, actually before that, the United States of America will cease to be a white majority country. No matter what they do with immigration, it's already there. And Latinos, we are the fastest growing constituency. So the book made a prediction. If the Democrats take into account the politically progressive tendencies of Latinos, well, that might be good news for all of us. But if the Republicans cultivate the socially conservative tendencies of us Latinos, then we are on a very different forest. Unfortunately, I have to tell you that the latter has came to pass. Having said that, I'm a philosopher, but every philosopher who comes from the global south knows that you need your ideas to be translated into practice. And so I've become very interested in, let us call it the poetics of history from below. What people who negotiate from a position of weakness or apparent weakness do. And this is exactly what the current president of Venezuela is doing, Delcy Rodriguez, whom I met when I was a student back in 2002 in Britain. Most people don't remember this, but her and her mother took over the Venezuelan embassy in London in order to protest against the then de facto ruler of Venezuela. And the one thing that impressed upon me about her was an answer to the question whether she is a radical leftist or else a moderate practice. My answer is yes to both of them. She's a radical pragmatist. This is how you negotiate from a position of weakness. So she keeps telling Trump, you are a criminal, you invaded our country, you threaten our neighbors, this is unacceptable. But at the same time, and we will resist you, but at the same time, we're ready to negotiate with you, however many barrels of oil you need.
Certainly, and the pragmatism is something that we are seeing as a way of dealing with Trump-Erica right now. Whether that will last is the question, and what follows. Rana, with Solo, you spent your time thinking, but with After Nations, you're actually telling us what you think is going to follow. When you say After Nations, actually just start by telling us what that means. Does that mean nations will end? Is the nation state going away as we know it?
No, I think that nations, I think it's important to realize that the nation state system we're part of is a very recent thing. And the reason we are 99.975% of us citizens of nation states is largely the result of the efforts of the Soviet Union and the USA after 1945 to break up European empires and to impose nation states as the only possible modern political form. So the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. Russia has for a long time been campaigning against the international order. So it has been the USA that has, until very recently, sustained the cellular system of modern politics as it is. And if the USA breaks ranks with that project, then we are going to have a very different kind of... There is no one else. China is not interested in taking up the slack that America might leave behind. China has an extremely different approach to how sovereignty works and everything. So what we're looking at here is the decline of American power. And my reading of Trump is that he comes into power at a time when it is not simply his maverick personality that's in operation. A lot of what Trump is doing is an accurate reading, is a response to an accurate reading of global affairs, which is to say that the USA can no longer play the role that it has done until now, and that the US has to prepare itself for a situation in which it is a co-equal imperial power with several other imperial powers. That is to say, it is not the capitalist superpower that it has been since 1945. It is now to use that phrase, that word, in a multi-power world. And the strategies for a multi-power world are very different. Now, for most of since the Battle of Waterloo, for most of that period, that's to say 200 years, one single capitalist superpower has governed the global system, has set the rules, has given the currency. That was Britain for the first of those centuries and the United States in the last 70 or 80 years. In the middle, we had a period where Britain was failing and there was a contested space. Would Germany be the next superpower? Would the United States be the next superpower, etc.? That 30-year period was extremely turbulent. It was a terrifying period to be in. We've all been, I wouldn't say all, many of us have been better off in the period of American supremacy. As that supremacy comes to an end, we have to sort of prepare ourselves for a different thing. And we realize, to respond to what you're saying about criminal and the international law, we realize that there never was any international law. America was always free to do exactly what it wanted, but it was in its interest for a long time to uphold a system of trading sovereign states. That was how America drew its global rents. But today, America no longer has that interest, and it's doing exactly what it wants, and now it's a different game.
Certainly, and as you said, what's possibly also changed is that America is no longer speaking of these shibboleths, no longer speaking of the rules that should have been governing the world. We've woken up this morning to the idea that Mr. Trump has invited 60 leaders around the world to be part of a Gaza peace board. Nobody's quite sure where that's going to go, but what we do know is that everyone who joins, there's a contributory fee of $1 billion. It begins to sound, as I said to someone, like a Ponzi scheme, sort of real estate, cooperative housing project, rather than a serious conflict resolution mechanism by a serious global superpower. Vince, we've had Rana say, the decline of American power begins to look like it could happen. And yet, Pax Americana had that comfort. Pax Seneca, we don't know where it's going to go. When it comes to the idea that the world is shifting its focus, has the center of gravity actually shifted from this very, very developed and wealthy West to China, to India, and to the global South?
Yes, it has shifted and will shift. This is the thesis in my book, The Eclipsing of the West. And if Trump has any long-term significance, it will be to accelerate that decline, I think. There's a couple of interesting statistics. The share of the world economy when the West won the Cold War was about 60% in 1990. It's now down to 40%, right? And you can quibble about the figures, purchasing power, GNP, and all that stuff. But these are the numbers of the IMF, the World Bank, even the American CIA don't dispute it. And those trends are going to continue, partly because of these sort of fundamental demographic things, urbanization, catch-up technology. And it's not just China and India, though they dominate, but Vietnam, Bangladesh, some of the dynamic African countries, Senegal, Ghana, the Ivory Coast. That process is going to continue. And it's particularly the case for China and India because they, however adverse the world scene, these have massive internal markets. I think people in India take for granted that the kind of thing that we find horrifically difficult in Europe, like migration, it's just part of your internal market. Biharis go from one end of the country to look for work. This is a fundamental driver of your long-term growth. And Manmohan Singh and this new government opened up the single market with tax reform and so on. And these are long-term drivers. So, China and India will almost certainly overtake the United States, if only in terms of economic size, China almost certainly technologically in the near future, and that's the kind of world we leave. I'm just talking in sort of rather arid economic terms, but I think there is a political underpinning here. There's a very interesting survey done of international trust in institutions and governments, done by the Edelman Index. And predictably, Western democracies are very low down, which is why we have our current upheavals. Those three countries at the top with the most trusted governments and institutions: China, Saudi Arabia, and India. People are surprised to see India there, but I think the reason is what has emerged is that the key thing in establishing trusted institutions is that you see one generation progressing from the last generation through growth, essentially. And that's happened here, it's happened in China, and I think on almost all plausible predictions. Of course, China's got problems with property collapses and so on, but if you're looking at the fundamental drivers, this change in the center of gravity, and in particular the demise of the US, I think are baked in.
And in your mind, because you talk about two different traps, the Thucydides trap, is that inevitable? That China and India, therefore, will be the next contenders, the rivals? Will they fight each other?
Well, the Thucydides traps, we go back to Athens and Sparta, the prediction of some people that they're bound to fight. Well, if you've got nuclear weapons, it's probably best not to do so, which is why the Soviet Union and the Americans never actually fought directly. And I think probably that will be avoided. A bigger trap is identified by economic historian Charles Kindleberger, and he argued that when a superpower is in a state of decline, who then takes responsibility for the system, right? The Americans established the international economic institutions and to good effect in many ways. But Trump in particular, for all his false clarity of mind, recognizes that reality. Americans are not going to take responsibility for the global system. So what the Kindleberger trap suggests, well, who then the hell is responsible for the global climate, Antarctica, protecting the seas from overfishing, space, and so on? And that is where the big gap is. And Trump is doing his best in a way to disengage from that responsibility. And the Chinese are not taking it up. Maybe there's a role for India here.
All right. So in that position of flux comes in some of the ideas that Oscar has talked about in his book. And I have to read out the entire book's name because each word means something. A hopeful political imagination, fantastic critique in the age of meltdown. Oscar, to begin with, just tell us what fantastic critique means.
I said I was interested in the poetics of history, how we describe historical events. When it comes to empire, we tend to go for vertical metaphors, ascent and descent, ascent and or decline. But when you look at the history and the political practice of those who have to negotiate from a position of, let's call it subordination for lack of a better term, you begin to notice that their metaphors, the metonymies, their use of the imagination is not vertical, but rather kind of horizontal and less spatial and more temporal. What do I mean by this? What I mean by this is exactly what in yesterday's session about the geopolitics of the 20th century, one of the panelists called historical sensibility, which is to say that there are two kinds of critique. You can set up standards. This is the gold standard, and then subsume under that standard an individual case. That's what we tend to do from a moral position. If something has happened this way in the past, then that will be the case. If it looks like the model, then that's good. But there is another kind of critique, and it's the one that I call fantastic critique, because it means answering the question, what comes next? What can happen next time? It is not enough to criticize by saying, oh, Trump and Trump America is not doing things according to the standards, to the rules of international law, because as Rana pointed out correctly, we in Latin America, we've known this forever. That's exactly what our experience has had to be. I mean, all the talk of international law and good standards, well, those standards and international law was always to be applied among so-called civilized nations. And we have always been excluded from that, from the 15th century onwards. So what do? We ask, what can happen next time? And the answer to that question is always paradoxical. It's never the old or the new. You cannot choose. It's more like, if you allow me, it's a paradox. So it's a two-horned dilemma, like a bull. How do you deal with a bull? Well, if you are a Hispanic bullfighter, you know that you cannot deal with a bull by standing aside and hoping the bull will not see you. It will come right for you.
Not if you're wearing that color.
So what do? You wear your colors, you attract the bull, and you try to grab it by the horns, both horns. That's exactly what you see someone like the current president of Venezuela doing. You grab it by the horns and then you pirouette. Like a bullfighter or a good dancer. You dance with a bull. When she says to Trump, You're both a criminal, you violated international law, but let us make business. What she's also saying is you want oil to flow to the United States so that the barrel of oil, which is right under $60 nowadays, which translates into bigger prices for Americans and therefore malcontent for American voters. This is what Trump wants. He wants it down to at least $50 per barrel.
Sure.
Now, this is exactly what Chavez promised the American government back then. Delcy is doing exactly the same. If you promise that the barrel won't go below $30, which is really bad for Latin American members of OPEC, then we promise it will not go, beyond 50.
Above, something
and
like
that will help Trump come the November election.
And certainly the control of what we can only call old world commodities, fossil fuels, is one part of it. But Rana, in your conclusion, you write a fairly strong case on technology and the fact that nation states do not have the capacity to deal with the demands of new age technology. Someone said to me, do you know that if you were to stack up the top 10 tech businesses in the world with the top 10 economies of the world, those top 10 would actually come in at third after the US and China. Do you think, in a sense, when you make the case that we're looking at a post-nation, after-nation reality, that it's actually these tech giants, if you like, that could be the new leaders of the world?
Well, I think that they play an important role in this conversation. I mean, I should make clear, I don't think nation states are sort of disappearing. But I do think that some of the things that Vince is talking about will reveal very ugly things about the West. Western liberalism coincides with the period that the West was much, much richer than the rest of the world. We haven't, until now, confronted deeply a world in which the West is a second-tier economic bloc. And I think when we do so, and we can already see that bloc is unlikely to be a liberal democratic bloc like it was in the late 20th century. The West has shown us, if we step back from a short perspective and look at a 200-300-year perspective, the West has not been a liberal political bloc at all. And I think that we're going to see a different kinds of, you were saying that already democracy and freedom have dropped out of the American vocabulary. So I think there's a dark future in the world of geopolitics. But like Oscar, the introduction to my book is called Hope, Not Despair. I think we should think of the opportunities in this situation. Let's not pretend that the system we are seeing decline was a perfect system. This is a system that has systematically transferred wealth from the poor of the planet to the rich for many, many decades. That is its fundamental design. There has not been this massive redistribution of wealth that people who designed the nation-state system in the 1940s thought might happen. So there are lots of people who have never benefited from this system at all. So let us look at what might be the things that we would like to correct in this moment. Let us look at opportunities. Now, the best people who are placed to look at the opportunities are the tech firms. It is in their DNA to see crisis and catastrophe as an opportunity. COVID was an excellent example of how quickly those companies maneuvered themselves to the center of the logistical system and advanced by many years their sort of expansion of power in the political system. So my answer to you here would be to say, let us do what the tech firms are doing. We can't rely on nation states to deliver a lot of the services and freedoms that they have until now. Tech firms are, I think, clearly set against many of our kind of aspirations as a species, and our aspirations for the planet. But they have shown us that it is possible to expand systems, expand transactions and platforms at an incredibly fast rate using technology. Let us borrow some of the things that they have done and shown us in the last 20, 30 years and apply them to the problems that we face as a species. How will we protect our citizenship, our rights, our freedoms in a face of nation states that are increasingly not preoccupied by those issues, they're preoccupied by other issues. Can we build platforms on which we, the people, the global people, can encode and protect those things without hoping that a nation state will do it on our behalf?
Now that brings me to my last round of questions, because I do want to come to questions from the audience. I traveled to a few countries in the past year or so. In Moscow, when you land, you enter a different tech sphere, right? You've got Yandex cabs, Google Maps work very slowly so that they can't have drones mapping them. You work within that sphere. If you go to China, if you're not on Weibo, you really have a very difficult time navigating what's going on there. We see versions of that in the rest of the world. Today, if you apply for an American visa, you're essentially committing to open up your Twitter handle. You're opening up all your social media, and an officer can, even after you get your visa, an officer at immigration, when you land in America, can deport you simply on the basis of what's in there, what you've said in the past. So I want to come to each of you, and Vince first, to say what is the future of each of these countries internally, in terms of spiritually? Are we going to essentially have the rights to everything, the right to development, the right to clean water, air, and all the rest, everything but the right to dissent? Is that the new world order?
Well, there is a danger, obviously. We have two superpowers at the moment, neither of them very attractive. We talked about Trump. I'm not sure everybody wants to live under Xi Jinping either. So, they're unattractive. But if you're looking for positive things in the world, which I think is what we want to do, I would mention several things. I mean, first of all, there is this idea developing of coalitions of the willing, right? Some countries which, through political courage or skillful diplomacy or whatever, are resisting bullying. I mean, two examples, Canada and Brazil, both of them quite vulnerable in some ways, but standing their ground against Trump without being sucked into the other side. And the other one is something that I've heard coming from the Indian government, it's something called multi-alignment, right? You don't accept that you have to belong to the global West or the other lot. You play one with the other, and you're flexible. And apparently that involves playing in China, actually, into the picture. There are things that we agree with them on. I mean, they're much better on climate and renewable technology than the US, so we have to work with them on that. I think the weak link, and I'll finish on this, but where I have ultimately some hope is Europe. We tend to forget that Europe, even without the UK, has an economy the size of China or the United States. And it's currently non-functioning. It's doing nothing, can't do economic reform. Their best leaders, like Macron, are paralyzed politically. They've got disruptive Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, and so on, and they're not doing anything. And on this key issue of tech regulation, where the Europeans are actually pioneering, they can't back it up because they don't have tech companies of their own. But if over the next 10, 20 years, and I say this as a European, I think, if the UK can reintegrate, not going to happen overnight, and Europe can move from being a rather dysfunctional confederation to a more functioning federation, then you potentially have a power which can offset some of the dangerous hegemony that's coming from other directions.
I see you're putting your political hat on and saying we'd be going towards unification, not more Brexit. Oscar, the answer to the right to dissent?
Well, let me begin with a very brief description of what has changed in terms of empire, how imperialism is going to be unleashed. What is its practice going to be like? We tend to think of empire and imperialism as territorial conquest. And as Rana was suggesting, that's no longer the case. We need all of us to educate ourselves on not only what tech bros and tech corporations, but all financial corporations, the ones who have to think temporally rather than spatially, do. And when he said that they profit from volatility, that is correct. That's exactly Trump's MO. He produces volatility, scrambles everything, and then makes a bet and profits from it. That's exactly the kind of a speculative thinking that we all need to learn about. For instance, there is no interest neither in Trump nor on the oil majors of the United States to gain real estate in Venezuela. I mean, why would you like to have real estate in the Orinoco River? Managing that is very messy. Then you have the guerrillas, you have the narcos, you have the swamp, you have all of that, and that can very easily go really wrong. So instead of that, what they want to do is to distribute the profits. That's how the oil business, not just the tech business, works. Oil companies are not in the business of extracting oil, but of making money. How do we do so? By something called a profit-sharing agreement. So that's the first difference, which means we're going to have more cartels, more of the kind of small, more localized leagues and alliances that Vince was describing. And to finish, my initial example of that is the Hague Group. This group of so far 6 or 7 smaller nations who have come out on behalf of the Palestinian people, precisely led by countries such as Colombia and or Brazil. Brazil is still the country to look at and a sort of a model to follow. They have been able to withstand Trump, to negotiate with Trump, so their tariffs were lowered, but they have also been able to put their own version of Trump, which is to say Jair Bolsonaro, out of the political game.
Okay.
That is an example to follow.
So you're actually holding up 2 hopeful examples. Rather, they've already done Europe and or South America. To the question about dissent, is that the one thing that'll go away in this new world?
I think the West is in for a bad time, and I think we haven't really talked about religion in this conversation, but I see liberalism, a Western ideology, as a sort of reformed Christianity of the 18th century, and that religion is in crisis, and you can feel in the West that there is a spiritual crisis right now. There are almost religious wars. We're thinking back to the 17th century again. The stakes in metaphysical questions in the United States today are murderous, are intensely high. The US has always been the least democratic part of the West in the sense that the US has always had to administer an empire, and it could never give its population too much access to the financial system and things like that. The US is used to repressing its population, and I think that the US is going to be a bad place for speaking out and things like that in the coming decades. Europe, which is going to be sleepier and slower, is not going to have the same interest in suppressing its conversation. But I have to say, in my own travels, I find that it is actually in Asia where there has not been the same kind of spiritual breakdown, and where economic growth, at least for certain portions of the population, is such that people have seen incredible advances in their own lifetime and think that their children are going to have a better life than they did. That just sets the tone for a sort of optimism and a sense that problems can be solved, that in itself is a resource at a time like this.
All right, so I told you at the beginning that the portentous clouds don't mean we won't have a very optimistic panel over here. I'm going to take a round of questions, come back to you for very quick responses, but I'd love to hear what everyone has to say. Maybe the gentleman in the hat here?
First of all, let me congratulate the panel.
And please, you're cutting into a lot of time, so just give us the question. Thanks.
Okay, now, the subject matter and substance of the discussion has been excellent. My question is straight. Given the asymmetry of information, what are the prospects of having a new alternative world order?
The asymmetry. The asymmetry of information, of people getting access to information. What does that mean for the New World Order? There's a gentleman, go ahead.
Hello, Suhasini. My question is to the panelists.
Just put the mic a little closer.
Do you believe that India has underplayed Trump's action in Venezuela? Or is it
Has India ever played?
Underplayed Trump's action in Venezuela? Or is it going to backfire in the long run?
Okay, very specific, okay. And the gentleman here?
हमारे भारत में
Sir,
English
अंग्रेजी में, because none of them are going to...
नहीं, I would like to speak in English, but before
No,
question.
just please give us the question. Thanks.
Okay. As far as my question is, in the today's scenario, India is playing a very balancing role, either with Russia or with America. So कई बार when we support two powers, then we lose very badly. What do you think about this?
All right. Can people afford to choose, or is the world so polarized now that India is going to have to choose to go with the Western camp or possibly the China, Russia camp? Vince, I know you have strong views on this, so I'll let you go first.
No, absolutely no reason to choose. I don't think... I've always sensed when I've been in India there is a great fear about the Chinese. But you actually have to work with them, and there is a lot of commonality, actually. I think the word frenemy is a good way of describing the relationship.
All right. Rana, you want to take the question on the asymmetry of information, the access to information?
Yeah, I mean, very, very quickly. I mean, I do think that there are extraordinary kinds of inequalities that are in the domain of finance, in the domain of data, that are opening up in a world that looks like it's very horizontal. And the extent to which the United States is now banking on the power accumulated by Silicon Valley to extend its sort of lead over China and things like this, I think that we are definitely in a world that's not only a world of geopolitical powers, it's also a world of private powers that are, I think, definitely introducing a world which is far more unequal.
That we have to look at. And Oscar, I'm going to let you take the Venezuela question. India's response to the US actions in Venezuela was very muted. Didn't mention the US, didn't talk about the international rule of law. You, of course, you're from Colombia, you live in the UK. Mr. Trump has said it could be Cuba, it could be Colombia next. How do you think the world should have responded? I know Europe wasn't particularly strident either.
Actually, it was very interesting for us in Latin America to see the muted response, not only of India, but of Europe. Because, to put it this way, the way we read that response in Latin America was that if Trump and the US of A is trying to claim back its so-called backyard, that backyard no longer includes solely Latin America, but also Europe. And Europeans are having a very hard time waking up to the fact what's coming for them. Greenland, all of a sudden, that's like a shock. And hence the second part of my question. There is a beautiful figure that the black poets of the Caribbean of the 20th century developed, is that of shocking return. And that means that when you send violence out there, you're thinking that violence will stay there. It never does. It comes back. And thus, if responses are muted because we're thinking, if we say nothing, then they will not look at us, it will not happen to us, you're wrong. And the same goes for the United States itself. The kind of violence that the US of A has unleashed, mostly on Latin America, for decades, is clearly coming back inside of the United States. What you saw in Minnesota is not an anomaly. That is something you're going to see more and more. The prospect of a civil war in America is something we need to take seriously.
Well, certainly the idea of how to react to this kind of unilateralism. We have like a minute and a half, so I won't take any more questions, but I want the audience to take away from this a specific answer on what the new world order is going to look like. There are those who say it'll be, as you said, 50 countries getting together on 50 issues in 50 different ways. It could be a new world order that's more representative, has India in it, has Africa has representation, South America and all the rest, or it could be some version of power politics. Might is right. So if each of you can just give me an answer to the question, what are we going to see? A new world order, a little bit of the old might is right, or no order at all? Go ahead.
You remember that character in Shakespeare's The Tempest, Caliban. My favorite line, and this is the way in which Caliban is interpreted in Latin America, and I think this is going to be the new world, how the new world order looks like, is when Caliban tells Prosper, oh, you imposed on me your language. Well, then I will use it to curse you.
All right. Go ahead, Rana.
How can you follow that?
You can't, and we're doing that, by the way, in many ways.
Yes, I mean, it's going to be a much more, in some ways, democratic, chaotic, and terrifying time, but where I think there are going to be a lot more actors. And private corporations are some of those actors, but also citizens are those actors. Because, as we know from the theater of war, the very, very few parties that control the instruments of war, it's been broadened out. Now everybody can almost wage war from their desktop. And so what new kinds of order come out of that is very difficult to predict, but it's certainly going to be very interesting and terrifying.
All right, no order. And where will you
I think if I'm looking 20, 30 years ahead, 3 economic superpowers, China, India, and the United States. Very important middle powers that we don't pay enough attention to, Indonesia, Turkey, Brazil, and others.
UAE.
And I think there will be, not the old world order post-war, but a lot of cooperation which just has to happen because of the compulsions. You know, people will work on climate because it's existential, and sensible governments will do stuff. There's a technical description of it called variable geometry. I think that's the kind of word we may be heading into.
All right, there's a lot of variables coming up, but you've been a great audience. Thanks so much for joining us, and do get the books and read them.
And thank you, Suhasini. She has been marvelous, and thank you. You're an absolutely fabulous audience.